In this video, we're going to explain how ultrafiltration occurs in the glomerulus and in the Bowman's capsule of the nephron. So this is the first part of the nephron. It's the first part of your story. Let's just make sure we know what we're looking at. So this is the start of the nephron. This is the Bowman's capsule. And in the Bowman's capsule, you've got that knot of small blood vessels or capillaries called the glomerulus. And obviously, once we form that filtrate in the Bowman's capsule, it's going to move down into the proximal convoluted tubule and then into the loop of Henle, the DCT, and the collecting duct. But what's happening in here is called ultrafiltration. So how does it work? Well, blood is going to move in to the glomerulus via an arteriole. Now this is called the afferent arteriole, and you'll notice it has a wider diameter or a wider lumen than this arteriole here, which is carrying blood out of the glomerulus. This one's called the efferent arteriole. So blood is travelling into the glomeruli or the glomerulus capillaries via the afferent arteriole, which is wider. So blood's coming in here, and because it's leaving through a narrower efferent arteriole, the blood is going to kind of back up in the glomerulus. It's kind of like a traffic jam where you're going from 4 lanes of traffic to 1 lane of traffic. Yeah, you've got blood coming in at a higher pressure, it's slowing down, it's backing up, and it can only leave through that narrower efferent arteriole. So in here, in the blood in the glomerulus, you've got a high hydrostatic pressure. And that's probably going to be your first marking point in an exam question about ultrafiltration. There's a high hydrostatic pressure, which is going to force small molecules out of the blood. So anything that's small enough is going to get forced out of the blood in the glomerulus, and it's going to make its way into the Bowman's capsule, where it's going to form what we call the filtrate. Now, to get a second mark, we should really give some examples of these small molecules that can be forced out by that high hydrostatic pressure. So small molecules such as water, obviously urea, we could say glucose, we could say amino acids or mineral ions. They are forced out of the blood. So they're going to leave the blood in the glomerulus and they're going to cross over this wall here and enter the Bowman's capsule, simply because they are small enough to do so and because there's a high hydrostatic pressure in these blood vessels that's going to force those substances out. We should also note that large proteins remain in the blood. And red blood cells as well. They're going to remain in the blood because they're too large. They're not going to pass through the filter, so they're going to stay in the blood. Okay, now we've still not got enough marking points because this might be a 4 or 5 mark question if you're asked to describe the process of ultrafiltration. So let's talk about exactly what these small molecules have to cross over. What is the filter that we keep talking about? So the small molecules that are forced out due to high hydrostatic pressure, such as water, urea, glucose, etc., they pass through what we call fenestrations in the capillary endothelium. So talking about the glomerulus and the capillaries from which it's formed, obviously the walls of these capillaries that form the glomerulus, their walls are just made of a single layer of endothelial cells. You'll remember that from year 12. The wall of the capillary is called the endothelium. It's just a single layer of endothelial cells, but there are gaps or pores between these endothelial cells that we can call fenestrations. Now, you don't have to use the word fenestrations. You can just say that the small molecules will pass through the gaps or the pores or the fenestrations in the capillary endothelium, just the gaps between those endothelium cells. So now they've got over the first layer of the filter, if you like. They've passed out through the gaps in the capillary wall, but then they also need to pass over the basement membrane. Now, the basement membrane sits between the glomerulus and the wall of the Bowman's capsule, and it's basically like a mesh or a matrix of proteins that kind of acts like a sieve. So again, it's going to let these smaller molecules pass through that kind of mesh of proteins, but it's going to prevent any larger proteins present in the blood or red blood cells from passing through that filter. Okay, so now we're nearly there. We've got the small molecules, such as urea and glucose, through the gaps in the capillary endothelium. They've also passed through the basement membrane, and then they're gonna, we don't really need to talk about podocytes. I don't know whether to talk about podocytes, guys. These cells here that form the kind of lining of the Bowman's capsule, they're called podocytes. And they have gaps between them as well to allow those small molecules to pass through into the Bowman's capsule. But it's not really on the mark scheme for AQA, so I'm just going to miss that out. But you might have heard of podocytes. It's just these surface cells here. And they've got like foot processes on, right? And gaps between them. So that's kind of like a third stage of the filter. But we can just get credit for talking about the capillary endothelium and the basement membrane. And then the small substances that have now been filtered form what we call the filtrate in the Bowman's capsule. And that's it really. So we've got all the marking points because we've talked about how the filtrate is formed due to high hydrostatic pressure. We've said which are the small molecules that are going to be forced out due to that high hydrostatic pressure. Always make sure you can give like 2 or 3 examples. We've also mentioned that large proteins remain in the blood, which is important, so they're not going to be present in the filtrate. We've also mentioned passing through the gaps in the capillary endothelium and passing through the basement membrane, finally into the Bowman's capsule to form the filtrate. And if you weren't told in the question, this is called ultrafiltration, then for sure, write that in your answer because you might pick up a mark for saying this process is called ultrafiltration. It's happening in the Bowman's capsule. It's the first thing we learn about when we learn about the nephron, and it's all about filtering those small molecules, importantly urea, out of the blood and into the nephron, into the filtrate. Guys, I hope you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions, and we'll continue our journey through the nephron in future videos. So make sure you are subscribed so you can see them.